Good afternoon. It is an honor to have with us today a distinguished public servant whose commitment to Indian country has been unwavering throughout her career. U.S. Senator from Minnesota Tina Smith has long been a strong advocate for tribal sovereignty, for self-determination for tribes, and for the federal government's trust responsibilities to Native nations. Senator Smith has worked across the aisle on a wide range of issues critical to tribal communities. Throughout her service, she has emphasized that tribes themselves know how best to advance their own economic development. She is focused on addressing challenges and amplifying opportunities, whether in housing, health, education, infrastructure, or public safety. Senator Smith, on behalf of all of us here at the Minneapolis Fed and the Center for Indian Country Development, thank you for your time and your leadership. We are deeply grateful that you're joining us from your Washington, D.C. office, and for your steadfast dedication to advancing economic opportunity in Indian country.
Well, Neel, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Neel. And thanks to everybody there. I'm sorry that we can't all be together in person, but I'm so grateful for the Minneapolis Fed and the work of the Center for Indian Country Development. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. And we're also acutely aware of how much is going on in Washington, D.C. So it means even more to us that you're taking time now to be with us. We really appreciate it. When you joined the Senate, I know you actively sought to be a member of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Tell us about that. Why was that so important for you to serve on that committee?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I was, of course, very aware that there's a long tradition of Minnesota senators serving on the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. And it was very important to me to be able to continue in that tradition. I also felt when I came into this role that I wanted to go to some of the unexpected places, to be in places and to be with people that sometimes are pretty invisible in the halls of power here in Congress. And so being able to do that with Minnesota's Native communities felt really important to me. Not only the 11 sovereign tribal nations in Minnesota, which are so rich in so many ways, but also the incredible urban indigenous community and the power and the richness of that community as well. And I often think that folks that are living in urban communities are also overlooked when it comes to issues around, kind of Indian country writ large. And then I would just also say that I have always approached this job as an opportunity to build relationships, and as starting when I was chief of staff for the mayor of Minneapolis, but then especially when I was lieutenant governor, I had begun to develop relationships with Minnesota's tribal leaders that were very important to me. And this was such a great opportunity for me to deepen those relationships and deepen our work together. So I'm so glad. It, in many ways, has been some of the most fulfilling work that I've been able to do in the Senate.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Both as lieutenant governor, which you just mentioned, and as a senator, you've worked closely with Native leaders in Minnesota and nationally. I'm curious, are there specific things that you've learned from them that has influenced your approach to policymaking?
Well, I mean, there's so many things. It's hard to be able to put, to kind of boil it down. But I mean, I think the first thing that I learned as I got to understand the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota, the Chippewa nations, and then the Dakota nations, was just understanding how different and how unique they are. And I think sometimes non-Native people think of all Native people as sort of the same in some way. I became so interested in understanding the histories and the cultures of all of these different places and the different people. Of course, many related in lots of very important ways, but also quite different. And then I became I've learned so much from tribal leaders and their communities about like how they know what works in their own communities, whether you're talking about food sovereignty or how you can use Native traditions to address the scourge of addiction and mental health, or how Native communities are figuring out how to reclaim their language and what that actually looks like. The entrepreneurialness of Native people is kind of a constant source of inspiration to me. As I was just up in Red Lake, as just one example, a couple weeks ago, and looking at how entrepreneurial the community is in terms of piecing together different sources of funding and different pathways to accomplish what it is they want to accomplish around food and building their bison herd was, I mean, you just learn so much from that every single day. Yeah. Neel, I wonder if you notice this, because I know this is something that you work on a lot, but I think sometimes impressions of Native people and Native communities are sort of a bit stuck in the past. It's like Native people are frozen in time as sort of a historical artifact, and just kind of getting past that and understanding like the richness of now and what they are doing now is, I find it really inspiring.
Absolutely. My own experience in the last 10 years that I've been at the Minneapolis Fed and having visited many tribes in our region, just as you said, how varied they are. I come at it just, you have a much broader portfolio. My colleagues and I are looking at through the lens of tribal economies and what
Yes.
their economic futures are. They're so varied. Some they just couldn't be more different in terms of their focus, the resources they have available, even things like you mentioned. What percentage of their members live on the reservation versus live in urban centers? There's a richness which creates opportunities, and they can learn from each other. It also creates challenges because there's no one size fits all solution that's going to work in every tribe. And so I think your points they really resonated with me. Curious,
Yeah.
are there any other, I mean, in your lifetime of work, you probably have hundreds of stories. Are there any other stories that stand out to you, either as a senator or before, that really capture some of the spirit of what you've personally seen on Indian country?
Well, as you say, there are just so many things, but I will just mention one. I think people maybe have some people have some basic awareness that the lands that were once native lands, the treaty territories, and then the ceded land it's a very complicated patchwork of realities. And we also understand that there's just been a lot of land that's been taken illegally from tribes around the country, including in Minnesota. And so one of the things that has been the most rewarding to me has been to work really closely with the Leech Lake band to help them gather back together acres of land, many thousands of acres of land that were taken from them, illegally, in error, over time, and being able to participate in that, to be their advocate in Congress, figure out how to build bipartisan support for that, watch them do the important work with the Forest Service and also with local landowners and with local elected officials to be able to get that done, was something that was really important. The term land back is, of course, a very powerful way of, very powerful for Native people, and to be able to see that actually happening in a very tangible way was a pretty incredible experience to be able to be a part of. Often when you're the senator, and I suppose it's the same in your job as too, there's been many, many, many years of work, and the question is, what is the piece that you can do during the time that you're serving? And I felt really blessed to be able to be at Leech Lake to help them, with brothers and sisters from all over the country, come to be able to celebrate that, reclamation of that land was really incredible.
That's great. You touched on something which is that struck me in this age of extreme partisanship that I feel like we're living in right now. Oftentimes, the issues around Indian country, my experience has been, they're not really partisan issues. That you are seeing Republicans and Democrats come together from the region. I'm just curious if there's anything there you could share about your own experience in the Senate.
One of the most rewarding things about being a senator working on Native issues is that it has traditionally been quite bipartisan. The Senate Indian Affairs Committee itself has a history of comedy and of respecting the minority when you're in the majority, because it's going to flip back and forth, is very, it's very deep into the culture of the committee. Many Native issues are actually quite parochial in the sense that they are very specific to a particular tribe and their water rights or their land rights. And so that means that there's a kind of a deference to the local leaders and the local understanding, and there's really strong support for Native issues on both sides of the aisle. And so I think you're absolutely right. It makes the work a lot less, a lot less hostile than some of the work that we're doing. And also, let's be honest. I mean, both Democrats and Republican administrations have to do much better when it comes to, for example, really understanding the principles of self-governance. And in the Biden administration, though we were so blessed to have Secretary Haaland, blazing that trail, there was still many parts of the administration where we struggled to get kind of a deep understanding of what self-governance really meant, how you could use 638 authority in new ways. And so, if you know what I mean, everybody has a lot to learn. You bring a certain humility to this work, which also makes it less partisan.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm curious, as you think about the future of Indian country and economic opportunity, are there certain key opportunities and or challenges that stand out for you that we should be thinking about as we think about the future of our own work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel quite sure that those of you at the Center for Indian Country Development are thinking about these issues. I bet we're very aligned on this. I know we are. I think the first is the deep need for access to capital and lending in Indian country. And this is something that I know that you have worked on a lot, and I think that it's so important. It's why, for example, it's so important to continue our work to support Native CDFIs, but there are many ways that we need to do that. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The second thing, and I hope we'll talk about this in more detail too, is just the deep issue of housing needs. And there's great examples of innovation on tribal land around building new housing and addressing the severe housing shortage. But I see that as a big a huge economic driver. And then the third thing is just the opportunity to really take full advantage of what self-governance authority can look like, and that is an economic development opportunity, it's a health opportunity, it's an education opportunity, all of those things. So those are three things that come to my mind as we think about like where we can kind of build on strength.
Those are great, and they absolutely resonate with me and with my colleagues here at the Minneapolis Fed. The housing one, just in particular, which I know you've done a lot of work on, going back a decade or 15 years. We've been working on these types of issues to try to understand what are the barriers, and there are many. You mentioned capital is a barrier. Obviously, the complexities around trust land and lending against trust land, and so we're really proud of some of the work that we've done over the decade or more to try to create a toolkit that can enable tribes and their members to get access to capital to try to close some of these gaps. But obviously the gaps remain. There are still many, many barriers, but hopefully we are making a contribution in reducing some of those barriers so that people have choices of where they live, choices of where they work. And I know you're aligned on that.
I think it's so important. And, I also think that, it's important for, broadly speaking around the state, it's really important for economic development efforts to remember to include the entrepreneurs that are working primarily on tribal land. And, I will never forget being up in the Bemidji area and having a great meeting with folks there around incubator, new entrepreneurial ideas, and this great conversation. This was quite a few years ago. I wouldn't make this mistake now. We had neglected to invite anybody from the Red Lake Nation to come to this discussion, which was a huge oversight on our part. And I was quite humbled by that. And of course, but there was Chair Siki there to make sure that the voice of Red Lake Nation businesses and entrepreneurs were heard. And so it's always a reminder to me of how there's economic opportunity within tribes, but that we all need to do a much better job of including tribal entrepreneurs and businesses in the broader efforts of the state.
Absolutely. In fact, for us at the Minneapolis Fed, sometimes we have meetings that are non-tribal businesses, and then we've got meetings that are tribal businesses, and then we ask ourselves, well, why are we making the segmentation? Why aren't we just having meetings of businesses and all local businesses are invited? And so I just think it's a reminder for all of us. We want to make sure that those voices are heard because there's a lot that we can learn from them, relevant to their own tribes and the economic futures, but I think relevant to the economy more broadly.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
As you know, Senator, census data and other data sources frequently lack data on Indian country. Now, mostly it's not due to lack of intention, but it's usually due to insufficient sample sizes. And we're trying to close that gap here at our Center for Indian Country Development. I'm curious if there's anything you can share about your own experience, why it's important to get access to high quality, accurate data. You're a policymaker, you're drafting legislation, you're shaping it. Are there any examples where good data has either made a really big difference or the lack of good data has been a real barrier to you as a policymaker?
Yeah, well, first of all, I really, really appreciate the work that you all are doing at CICD around this. And I understand, I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, that you've just recently released this new report on the relending pilot program, I think, for native CDFIs, which is a great example of like, okay, let's get some data and let's really understand what's working, what we can learn from this. But I mean, across the board, this is a challenge. During the pandemic, we struggled so much with a lack of good data about what was really happening on the ground. And it's also interesting as you think about this, how the federal government needs to be much more adept at figuring out how to provide data to tribal entities that need that information in order to be able to make good decisions, in order to be able to, in some cases, apply for grants. We struggled a lot with this also during the pandemic when tribal epidemiology centers were not afforded the same access to information and data as, public health departments in other, in other communities. And that was a real problem for them as they were trying to figure out what to do to help take care of their people. And yet, of course, we saw during the pandemic that when tribes had the resources to put together strong vaccination programs and other public health strategies, that they were much more successful when they were able to run that based on what they knew about their own communities. So I'm kind of an old-fashioned girl. I believe that we should follow the facts and the science and the data where we have it, and we should make sure that we have the best available data. And I'm just grateful for the work that you're doing to make that more of a reality for us.
Well, that's a great example. By the way, I didn't know that fact about that some tribes didn't have access to the public health data. We did observe that there was great variation about how various tribes responded to the pandemic. And some were very effective in getting to their members very quickly, establishing protocols that were then followed, and were really leading the way in making sure that they could protect their members while also preserving their economy. So I thought that's a great example. Here at the Fed, as you know, we stood up several emergency lending programs in partnership with the U.S. Treasury Department. And we also, in many cases, were blind. We didn't have the data that we needed to be able to structure those programs quickly to get, even if programs were designed for tribal, let's say CDFIs or tribal small businesses to get access to it. A lot of times those programs weren't necessarily optimally designed, not because we didn't want to, but because we didn't have enough information to be able to understand exactly how to design those. And so that's what opened our eyes to this acute data shortage that we faced. And that's what led us to say we need to double down and really invest in trying to close those data gaps so that we can fulfill our obligations that Congress has given us.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so great. And we, if you really can see, my view is that if you really can truly see and understand the disparities that exist because of lack of investment, then you are just in a better position to be able to get after it. And that is, it's so much the case when it comes to healthcare, just as one example.
So we only have a few minutes left, Senator. This has been a great discussion. Let's go back to housing for a moment. Everywhere I travel in our region, on not just tribes, across the state of Minnesota, across our region, housing is a challenge. Housing supply, housing affordability. It's a local issue, it's a state issue, it's also a national issue. It's not a partisan issue. It's blue state, red state, purple state. It's across the board. I'm just curious, given your extensive experience working on housing issues, are there any things top of mind that you think of relating to Indian country or just across the state of Minnesota that we should all be focused on?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I always start from the core value that everybody deserves a safe, decent, affordable place to live, and that if that you don't have that in your life, then probably nothing else in your life is going to work. And so it is really, to me, and I mean, I've learned this from so many, in so many different communities, it really is the foundation. And, yet we also know that the severe housing shortage that exists broadly in this country is often particularly acute in rural communities and especially acute in tribal lands where it is, particularly difficult to work through some of the challenges around getting a mortgage and building a home. And there's also such an ethic in Native communities about this is a great example, actually, of the importance of data. How you measure homelessness, for example, on tribal lands might be quite different because homelessness is going to, people living without a home is going to be, you're going to see it in extreme overcrowding rather than folks actually living outside, which you just are not going to see as much because of the culture of many Native communities. And so that's a great example of how you need to be able to measure in the right way. I worked hard on that with the Department of Housing and Urban Development to try to improve that. So I think that that housing supply issue, figuring out the the financing and the roles that Native CDFIs can play here is really important. And then I also just want to highlight some of the great innovation that's happening. For example, in Lower Sioux, the work that Lower Sioux is doing with developing hempcrete as a construction model and also as a business model to be able to sell and be a revenue generator is just another. I love that example of kind of entrepreneurship for those folks at Lower Sioux.
No, that's great. And obviously, that's a good example of something where it can help their own local economy, but it also can be serving a broader market around the country, potentially around the world. And so that's it's good for everybody.
That's
well,
right.
Senator, I think we could go on for another 30 minutes easily, but I know you have a busy agenda in Washington, D.C. And I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us today, but also thank you again for your lifetime of leadership on these issues. And I look forward to working with you into the future to try to bring more economic development to Indian country and partnership with us here at the Minneapolis Fed. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to do this with you and take good care. I'll see you soon.
Okay, see you. Bye-bye.